Well, hello everybody, Mike here with Hardware Canucks, and if you remember, I have done a bunch of 120mm fan videos. I've actually done a massive roundup that you can find sort of right up here. Now, in those videos, everybody kept on asking, what about RGB fans? And that's what this video, the best RGB fans, is all about. And let me tell you, some of these that I have are not the best of the best. They're actually super disappointing. But anyways, I wanted to get into the 12 competitors to kick things off. So starting with the least expensive here by a long shot is the Thermalright C12CS, which goes for just $6. Yup, $6 per fan. But like a lot of the others on this list, Thermalright tends to sell these as a triple pack a lot more often than singles. And trust me, $18 for that is an absolute steal. But I do have to note though that the C12CS does have a bigger brother called the B12S that has even better overall stats, but I couldn't find them for sale anywhere here in North America, and some on import sites like AliExpress have been flagged as fakes in various forums. So I'll definitely need to come back to those at some point. Then there's the Phanteks M25, which comes in at an amazingly inexpensive $15, but stock is a little bit hard to find lately. And a bit higher, you have the P12 PWM PST RGB, which is a heck of a lot more than the standard P12. The AlphaCool Rise Aurora, on the other hand, is $20. Okay, actually $25 because you'll need to buy, get this, an RGB adapter for it. No, I'm not kidding. And Enermax's Squaw is in this roundup too, and it sits around the same price. Step above that, and we've got the Scythe Kaze RGB and EK's new loop fan that just replaced their Vardar Evo. Of course, I also needed to include the Arctic Bionics P120 and Be Quiet's Light Wings, but in its high-speed format, not the regular one. And then there's the expensive ones. The brand new Lian Unifan AL120 V2. That's basically a Unifan on steroids, and it's launching a little bit later this month. There's also Cooler Masters Mobius 120p, and the big boy, most expensive fan in this roundup, the Corsair ML120 Elite RGB. So what we're doing here is running the gamut from a cheap as chips fan, literally this Thermalright costs less than a big bag of Doritos here in Canada, to one of the most expensive 120mm RGB fans around. So these are basically them, and I know a lot of you guys are yelling at your screen right now saying, why didn't you include this fan or that fan? And look, I listen to all of the comments, and I usually bring in those fans to do in other roundups or individual reviews a little bit later. So if you have a suggestion, please, please, please just put it down below and be confident I will be reading it and I will be checking it out. But you know what you should check out? That is this new case from Thermaltake.
The Series 500, man, that sounds like a spaceship with these 60% porosity panels and perfect dust filtration on all the ventilated areas. An optional LCD can be mounted on the PSU shroud for extra bling. All fan locations fit 140mm fans for that powerful and colorful takeoff, because cooling is now supported by the new best performing case fans from Thermaltake. Plus, that PCI area rotates on the frame level for proper FPS destroyer support, so you don't waste any potential. Check it out below.
Anyways, before I get any further, I need to have a little bit of a time to rant about the RGB market in general. And look, I'm not even talking about the broken ass motherboard software that's out there, because that's bad enough, but sometimes it actually does work. No, I want to talk about these manufacturers who are out there who are hell-bent on locking you into their own proprietary ecosystem, bypassing that motherboard software, or not even allowing you to have the motherboard software as a fallback solution. Instead, what they want to do is they want to pop you into their broken, crash-prone, non-user-friendly environment that sometimes does work, but most of the times it doesn't. And for that, I'm actually going to be pointing my finger directly at two of the biggest supporters of this channel over the years. That would be Corsair and NZXT. Buy one of their fans and you have no choice but to run IQ or CAM, and that means if you want one or two fans, you'll also need to pony up the money for a separate controller box. Lian sort of falls into the same category, but they actually allow you to run their Unifans through a standard 5V RGB connector. I mean, you lose some functionality, but at least the option's there. Either way, I do have to appreciate working standalone apps, because by and large, they actually do give you a lot more fine-grained control over the RGB items that you're paying for. But speaking of the lighting, I really wanted to talk about that too, because this whole video is about more than just raw performance. You're buying RGB fans for the look, and which ones of these have the best looking lighting effects. Of course, the UniFan takes the cake for the most original and probably one of the best looking RGB fans ever created. There's a lot of copycats coming out this year too. Those little accents Lian Li added to the sides on this generation are a pretty nice touch, and the ability to just connect them together side by side for daisy chaining, well, that's just the icing on the cake. The Rise Aurora looks crazy good too, with your usual inner fan blade glow and a subtle ring effect too. Meanwhile, the ML120 might be by far the most expensive fan here, but it's also one of the best looking, with a super even light distribution. But I'd argue the EK loop actually outdoes it, since there are 9 LEDs that are mounted upwards under the motor hub, and that creates an even better overall look, and it was able to display a little bit more saturated colors too. The Fantex M25 is pretty stunning all by itself, and it's nice to see at least one fan here without a sticker mounted to its center hub. Meanwhile, some fans like the Scythe, Arctic P12, Thermalright C12C, and Cooler Master Mobius use your typical garden variety of RGB LED setups, and they aren't anything special. Great if you want no frills lighting, but not good if you want something a bit more unique. Other fans, like the Light Wings, use a halo effect if that's something you're after, and it's nice to see Be Quiet also offering a bit more subtle effect on the backside too. The Arctic Bionics takes that to the next level, with more of a light tunnel look, since its frosted perimeter extends further into the fan itself. And then there's the Enermax Squaw. First of all, its square look is pretty unique, but definitely not for everyone. But then flip it over and you're greeted with this. I mean, I don't want to insult anybody's personal preference, but I'm really no fan of this glittering crystal look being inside of my case. And look, I also wanted to bring up some of the issues that we ran into when running these fans. First of all is the AlphaCool Rise Aurora. So this guy. I alluded to this in the intro, but I have to mention it again. They basically shipped this fan bare bones, so no adapters, no nothing, but they are running this with a 3-pin JST connector instead of your typical 5-volt RGB that'll plug directly into your motherboard. And guess what? They're gonna happily sell you an adapter for this that'll cost you $5. I also got a bit triggered when I saw Fantex including black extension cables with white fans that also have white cables. I know it's a small thing, especially when the fan costs so little, but Thermalright did it and their fans actually cost less. Bionics fans have this amazing ability to daisy chain together without cables, but it's done with the world's flimsiest connector. EK is on the completely opposite end of that spectrum, since they are using one heck of a beefy microfit 8-pin for daisy chaining. I mean, it looks like a mini PCIe connector, so props to them for thinking outside the box, but the size does make it a little bit harder to tuck away out of sight. Another problem is how well these fans, or not well these fans, produce a white color. Some tend towards a blue hue, while others go towards a bit warmer tone, and others, well, they're just terrible. Sadly, RGBW, where the W denotes a dedicated pure white LED, isn't a thing yet for fans. But man, good luck if you're going for an all-white build. So I think that gives me a perfect segue into one of the main issues with RGB fans, and that is basically a doubling of the cables, which can sometimes make cable management a complete pain in the ass. But a lot of fans actually allow you to quickly and easily daisy chain their fans together, while other ones don't. And I really did want to give some props to the ones that do it properly. So here it is, and I really hope this helps you guys. Some of these fans are perfect since they allow for daisy chaining of both the fan and RGB cables. Others don't have any daisy chaining whatsoever, while most allow only the RGB signal to be passed from one fan to another. For the fans that don't have anything, you'll need to buy a separate splitter cable, a hub, or a triple pack that sometimes comes with one of those. I also wanted to talk about something that I haven't touched on in my previous videos, and that is warranty, because adding RGB effects to the fans basically adds another point of failure. And according to you guys, on a poll that I did on Twitter, that you can find right over here, almost a quarter of people are running into RGB problems in general. So take this for whatever you will. Either some manufacturers having more confidence in their products than others, or a question of whether you'll actually get any warranty support on the longer terms. But regardless, some companies are a lot better here than others. While some, like Thermalright, well, I couldn't even find a warranty term for these fans. Now, before I get into the actual performance results, there are a couple of housekeeping items that I want to get to. And the first one of those is a comparison between what manufacturers claim is their top line rotational speed for these fans versus what you actually get. Let's start off with what these companies claim, sorted from the slowest to the fastest. And remember, manufacturers typically give themselves a tolerance of 5 to 10%, so there's some leeway here. Now let's overlay what we logged, and for the most part, every single fan nails their RPM level, but there's some small outliers too. For example, the Kaze overshot its target by just over 100 RPM, but the Fantex M25 ended up falling short of its goal by an average of 131 RPM across those 3 different samples. One of them actually hit 1,852 RPM. Now that's still technically within their tolerances of 150 RPM, but it's the only fan here that undershot by anywhere close to that amount. The other thing I wanted to talk about is, of course, how the results that you're going to see are portrayed. First of all, the entire methodology for this video is down in the description below. Not much has changed, but there has been some small modifications as we move towards a more holistic methodology a little bit later this year. But anyways, the bigger thing that we needed to discuss is how the charts are presented and how to read them. So what you'll see for a raw CFM testing is a chart like this, where the x-axis shows how many CFM these fans can move. Meanwhile, the x-axis shows how noisy in decibels each gets to produce that given CFM. That means we can see how much air a fan can move relative to the amount of noise it produces. The further a fan goes towards the right, the louder it is. Meanwhile, the further towards the top a line is, the more air it's moving. So the best fans here will have the highest results at the shortest possible noise curves. This approach also prevents high noise, ultra high RPM fans from stacking the cards in their favor. All right, so we've got a dozen fans to get through. So I wanted to kick this off right away with raw, unrestricted CFM test results. First of all, I'm adding the P12 Max to this as a benchmark 120mm non-RGB fan. And let's start with the bottom dwellers here, the Scythe Kaze and the Arctic Bionics. Believe it or not, the Alpha Cool Rise Aurora is a decent performer at low noise, but then the wheels sort of fall off until it's actually the worst fan at 46 decibels. Even the Enermax Squaw ends up matching or beating it at certain points. The Light Wings, on the other hand, is closer to the bottom of the pack when things start off, but it hits a pretty good stride at around 42 decibels and beyond. The Fantex M25 behaves pretty much the same way. It's disappointing below 41 decibels, but give it a bit more juice and it actually becomes one of the better fans here. Even the P12 gets in on the action by embarrassing the Bionics and becoming a relatively good budget-focused RGB case fan. But then there's the top dogs. First of all, the EK Loop is probably one of the most impressive results here, since it offers a really linear progression of air movement relative to noise. And yet, check out the Lian Li AL120 V2. It actually beats the Loop right across the board and even matches the P12 Max in some cases. It does have a very narrow sweet spot between 38 and 41 decibels though. The Cooler Master Mobius, on the other hand, well, it's simply the best fan in this test. Not only can it match or beat the AL120 V2 in low noise situations, but it has that extra gear above 43 decibels where it actually maxes out at a whole 73 CFM. You'll notice though that there's 2 fans missing, one of which is the ML120. Look, it has solid middle of the pack results, but it's also the most expensive fan here, and you don't want to be paying megabucks for mediocrity, do you? The other is the Thermalright C12CS, which for its price is shockingly good. It matches or beats fans that cost 3, 4, or even 5 times as much. I mean, everyone's been talking about this thing in our comment threads, and I absolutely see why now. Going beyond 46 decibels, well, the M25 and Alpha Cool are the only ones that get to this point, and you can see why we equally weigh all the noise results. If we were just running these things at full speed, the Rise Aurora would look amazing, but in the end, it's an average fan at best. If we look at how all these fans compare at full speed without worrying about noise, it looks something like this. Then let's add the rotational speeds. Personally, I think the most impressive thing here is the fact the M25 can hit almost 70 CFM while running at such a low speed. Now let's expand that for all the fans we've reviewed so far. And it's pretty obvious, even the best RGB fans can't compete against high-end, non-RGB models when running at full tilt. On the other hand, there's still a lot of middle-of-the-pack fans out there, regardless of whether you have fancy lighting or not. But narrow that down to a constant decibel level and things start to get really interesting. Here, the AL120 V2 suddenly jumps ahead of the P12 Max, while the Mobius and Loop get pretty darn close too. You can also see that a bunch of fans feed off their high speed and high noise levels to be competitive, because the Lightwings, Aurora, Kaze, and Bionics all sort of start falling apart at a nominal noise level. And that becomes even more evident when all the RGB and standard fans are next to one another. Those four are still bottom dwellers. Meanwhile, the Loop, Mobius, and AL120 V2 are super competitive against everything out there. So those unrestricted tests are a very good indication about how these fans will perform when they're being used in their natural habitat. So basically being used as really nice looking case fans, but in a case that doesn't have a very restrictive dust filter or anything else preventing its airflow. But what happens if your case does have some restrictions, or if you want to use this on a radiator or a heatsink? Well, that is where the next set of tests, the restrictive tests, come into effect. These really separate the men from the boys. And guess what? The wheels just completely fall off the Corsair ML120 Elite. It's one of the worst performers, even though it's the most expensive. Alpha Cool's Rise Aurora is, believe it or not, even worse at low noise levels, but then sort of pulls it together above 41 decibels. But trust me, that's not saying much. The Lightwings also wheezes its way through at the beginning, but then pulls out some half-decent results if you're okay with more noise. Arctic's Bionics actually did the opposite by being very competitive below 40 decibels, but it levels off after that. The P12 ARGB performs almost identically at low RPM, but it's surprisingly good as it reaches peak speed. A surprising entry here is Enermax's Squaw, which didn't do all that well on the raw CFM test, but it does pretty good here relative to its price and rotational speed. It's just too bad that Enermax only offers their higher RPM model on AIOs and doesn't sell it individually, because I'm pretty sure it would do very well here. Meanwhile, the EK Loop, Kaze, and M25 are literal carbon copies of one another, but the Loop does have a bit better performance at lower decibel levels, while the Kaze sort of peters off above the 44 mark. Cooler Master's Mobius is on a whole other level compared to these other RGB fans. It does have one surprising challenger though. Guess who that is? Thermalright, with a fan that costs less for a triple pack than a single Mobius will put you back. Cooler Master's only edge is the fact the Mobius tops out at a much higher RPM level. And that leaves the AL120 V2. Relative to its raw CFM testing, its performance has dropped like a stone. On the positive side, it's just slightly behind the Mobius, but if we overlay the P12 Max into this equation, it's pretty obvious Lian's flagship fan took it on the chin in this test. It just can't maintain the performance we saw in unrestricted scenarios. As a matter of fact, if we expand this, choosing a non-RGB fan like the P12 Max becomes a no-brainer if you want the best possible performance in an airflow restrictive situation, especially if you're okay with louder noise levels. So overall, none of these fans is exactly the best possible solution for use on radiators, but there's a few decent options like the M25, Loop, and Mobius. I'm leaving the Rise out of this equation since it might look good here, but it makes a bloody racket while running at 2500 RPM. And once we add all the other fans, you can see the gap between the best RGB fans and the top 5 regular fans has grown by a massive amount. Narrow that down to 39 decibels among the RGB crowd, and this is where Thermalright really shines, along with the Mobius and AL120 V2. Then there's a pretty big drop before we get to the others. You can also see some fans have their results completely inflated due to their ability to run at higher RPM, but end up suffering when comparing apples to apples. The M25, Bionics, Lightwings, ML120 Elite, and especially the Rise Aurora fall into that category. So let's summarize what this all means. First of all, if you want a case fan, there's plenty of options in the RGB space, especially if you have a case with relatively few restrictions on airflow. But if you just want pure performance for a radiator or a heatsink, well, that's where the RGB fans, especially relative to their price, just get trounced by the T30, Gentle Typhoon, P12 Max, and Silent Wings Pro 4, not to mention a couple of the other less expensive fans in the non-RGB space. At least that is what the raw data shows. But what happens if we move to real-world testing, where we look at temperature results on an AIO and a heatsink? And starting at full fan speeds on a Corsair H60, all of these get better results than the crappy stock fan that AIO comes with, but none can beat the P12 Max either. There's a few highlights and lowlights too when we add the decibel readings to this. The Aurora needs to get ultra loud in order to get middle of the pack results, and based on their price, the Lightwings and ML120 Elite simply underperform. The interesting thing is the EK Loop didn't exactly get the best CFM results, but it's outpacing the competition in real-world testing, and you can also see the kind of phenomenal value the C12C brings to the table too. It's one of the quietest fans here, but it's competing right alongside the AL120 V2 and Aurora, moving things down to a quieter 36 decibels, and there's a lot less space separating the best from the worst. On the other hand, the Mobius's high static pressure at low RPM levels means it can dominate in situations like this one. I also wanted to point out the M25, Squaw, and Kaze are all running under 1100 RPM here, and that points to them being relatively noisy fans at lower RPM levels. Moving on to performance on a pretty standard air cooler, and suddenly the Fantex jumps out to a small lead, but to be honest with you, any of the top 4 RGB fans could be used interchangeably here. And overlaying noise onto this, it's obvious Noctua's focus for the stock U12S is on silence. And if you want any noticeable performance increase, you'll also need to sacrifice noise. Level things out to 36 decibels and the situation changes a lot, with the M25 suddenly being pushed to the bottom, along with other underperforming fans. This also shows you the power of the stock U12S. It's absolutely amazing in delivering high performance at low noise levels, but the best RGB fans stay the best here, with Thermalright edging into the top 4 again too. Alright, so there you have it. After analyzing almost 10,000 data points to create this video, well, it comes down to choosing the best RGB fan is not exactly the easiest thing to begin with, because it's not just about pure performance. When you're choosing one of these things, it's probably almost just as much about looks as it is for performance. If you want absolutely stunning looks coupled with very good performance, Lian Li's brand new AL120 V2 is almost impossible to beat. Just take note that it fares a hell of a lot better as a case fan versus being mounted on a radiator or heatsink. Also, to get the most out of its lighting, you'll need the L-Connect 3 app, which is probably one of the most stable RGB programs I've used, but it still ain't perfect. The best performance overall though has to go to the Cooler Master Mobius. For an RGB fan, it's just a freaking beast. but it's definitely not cheap either, and it doesn't exactly look the best. Meanwhile, the EK Loop literally gives 90 to 95% of the Mobius's performance. It has better overall lighting, and it costs quite a bit less too. Honestly though, I would actually choose the EK Loop over the Mobius in most situations, especially because it is quite a bit cheaper. The only thing that you might run into is availability for the EK Loop. Now, that brings me to the biggest winner in all of this roundup, and that has to be, guess who? The Thermalright C12CS. Mostly because, look, it is not the prettiest here. It doesn't actually give you the best top-end performance because it is an extremely quiet fan. But at low noise levels, it can compete with some of the best, most expensive fans right now on the market. This thing really blew my mind, and I am giving it the Damn Good Value Award. Yes, the awards are back again. The other one I wanted to talk about very quickly is the Phanteks M25. It is also an exceptional value if you can find it, because right now availability on this thing is a little bit spotty, and watch out for those scalpers because sometimes this thing goes for stupidly high amounts of money. And now for the losers, and I'm gonna try not to swear or be ultra angry at this, but this is really something that is starting to bother me. I am going to introduce you to the Corsair ML120 Elite. And I would love to say that I was surprised by this fan, but I wasn't. That is because exceedingly high priced, underperforming fans has become par for the course when it comes to Corsair. If this thing was $10, $15, $20, maybe even $25, it would be perfectly okay. But at its current price, it is absolutely preposterous. And the fact that it is tied to IQ software without any fallback whatsoever through your motherboard's 5-volt RGB connector, it is a solid pass from me. The Rise Aurora and Lightwings were also disappointing, and that's pretty sad since Alpha Cool and Be Quiet are known for delivering very high quality products when they try. I mean, just look at the Silent Wings Pro 4, which is one of the best fans ever created, or the Ice Bear AIOs from Alpha Cool for proof of that. So they can absolutely do better. And all the other fans that I didn't mention in this conclusion, well, they just didn't stand out as being anything special. I mean, I suppose if you can find them on sale in your region, or if they go on a fire sale, then yes, they're definitely good options. And I do have to acknowledge that the full range of fans that we're looking at here, especially a lot of the top competitors, aren't available in some regions, or they're just obscenely high priced. But anyways, I really hope that you enjoyed this roundup. I am Mike with Hardware Canucks, and I will definitely see you in the next one. Have a great day, guys.